the story of a U.S. airman who defied death in the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, glittering desert of water that promised nothing but death. Louis Zamperini lay sprawled in a tiny yellow raft, his lips cracked and bleeding, his skin blistered from the relentless sun. Around him, dorsal fins cut through the water like knife blades. Circling, always circling. It was May 27, 1943, and he had been adrift for just one day. He had 46 more to go. This is the story of how an Olympic athlete turned bombardier survived an ordeal so extreme that it defied all medical understanding, a tale of human endurance that would make him one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II. The boy who learned to run before Louis Zamperini became a castaway, before he wore the uniform of a United States Army Air Forces bombardier. He was a juvenile delinquent running from the police in Torrance, California. Born in 1917 to Italian immigrants, young Louis was a troublemaker of the highest order. He stole food, broke into houses, and developed such a talent for evading capture that the local police knew him by name. His parents worried he'd end up in prison or worse. But Louis's older brother Pete saw something else in the boy. He was fast, incredibly fast, and all that running from the law had given him the kind of endurance most athletes spent years developing. Pete pushed Louis into competitive running, and the transformation was miraculous. The kid who couldn't stay out of trouble suddenly had a purpose. By his senior year of high school, Louis had set a national interscholastic mile record of 4 minutes, 21.2 seconds, the record that would stand for nearly 2 decades. In 1936, at just 19 years old, Louis Zamperini qualified for the Olympic Games in Berlin. He finished 8th in the 5,000 meters, but his blistering final lap caught Adolf Hitler's attention. The Führer requested to meet the young American runner, shaking his hand and calling him the boy with the fast finish. Zamperini returned home a celebrity with dreams of the 1940 Olympics dancing in his head. He enrolled at the University of Southern California and trained relentlessly. Experts predicted he would be the first person to break the 4-minute mile. Then the war came, and those dreams evaporated like morning mist into the wild blue. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Zamperini's athletic career came to an abrupt halt. Like millions of young American men, he felt the call to serve. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September 1941, drawn to the adventure and danger of flying. After completing bombardier training, Zamperini was assigned to the 372nd Bombardier Squadron, 307th Bombardier Group, and stationed in Oahu, Hawaii. He flew on a B-24 Liberator bomber nicknamed Superman, a formidable flying fortress armed with 50 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying thousands of pounds of bombs. The B-24 was one of the most important American bombers of the war, but it had a reputation. Crews called it the flying coffin because of its tendency to catch fire when hit. It was difficult to fly, uncomfortable, and prone to mechanical failures. Still, it got the job done, and Zamperini completed several successful combat missions over the Pacific. But on April 20th, 1943, during a bombing run on Japanese-held Nauru Island, everything went wrong. Superman was shredded by flak and ground fire, taking over 500 rounds of ammunition. The hydraulic system was destroyed, the oxygen system was shot out, and the tail gunner was killed instantly. 4 other crew members were wounded, bleeding out at altitude as the pilots struggled to keep the crippled plane airborne. Somehow, miraculously, they made it back to base. Superman was so badly damaged that it would never fly again. The crew was lucky to be alive. 3 weeks later, their luck ran out. The Green Hornet's last flight on May 27th, 1943. Zamperini wasn't even supposed to be flying. He and his crew were given a brief respite after the traumatic Nauru mission, but another B-24, the Green Hornet, had gone missing during a search mission, and a rescue plane was needed to look for survivors. The Green Hornet was available, though it had a troubled history of mechanical problems. Several crew members had refused to fly on it, calling it a musher, a plane that felt sluggish and unreliable. Still, orders were orders, and a crew had to be assembled. Zamperini volunteered to go along as a bombardier, joining pilot Russell Allen Phil Phillips and 9 other men. It was supposed to be a routine search mission. They'd fly out, scan the ocean for survivors or wreckage, and return in time for dinner. They took off from Funafuti Atoll in the morning, the Green Hornet's 4 engines roaring to life as it lumbered down the runway and into the tropical sky. For 2 hours, they searched the empty Pacific, finding nothing. Then, about 850 miles from base, the unthinkable happened. The number 1 engine suddenly failed. In a properly functioning B-24, losing 1 engine wasn't necessarily fatal, but the Green Hornet was far from properly functioning. The plane immediately began losing altitude, and before Phil could compensate, the number 2 engine died as well. Now, they were in serious trouble. Phil fought with the controls, but the Green Hornet was falling from the sky. The nose dropped sharply, and the plane began a death spiral toward the ocean below. Men tumbled through the fuselage, equipment flying everywhere. Zamperini grabbed onto whatever he could, watching in horror as the blue Pacific rushed up to meet them. The impact was catastrophic. The Green Hornet hit the water at over 200 miles per hour, and the plane began disintegrating on contact. The nose sheared off, and water exploded into the fuselage with the force of a bomb. Everything went dark as the ocean swallowed the aircraft whole. Zamperini found himself trapped underwater, tangled in wires and debris inside the sinking bomber. The water was shockingly cold and dark. His lungs screamed for air as he fought to free himself, but the wires had him in a death grip. The plane was sinking fast, pulling him down into the depths of the Pacific. In that moment, with his consciousness fading and death mere seconds away, something clicked. With a final, desperate surge of strength fueled by pure survival instinct, Zamperini tore himself free from the wires. He kicked toward the surface, his lungs on fire, and burst through the waves just as his vision began to tunnel. He gasped for air, coughing and sputtering, and looked around frantically. Wreckage floated everywhere. Pieces of the Green Hornet spread across the waves like a junkyard. And there, clinging to debris, were 2 other men, Phil Phillips and tail gunner Francis Mac McNamara. Only 3 of the 11 men aboard the Green Hornet had survived the crash. The first night, they were alone, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with no food, no water, and no idea if anyone knew they were missing. But they did have 2 life rafts. The rafts were standard issue for downed airmen, small inflatable rubber boats, each about 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. They were designed to keep men afloat, nothing more. One raft had inflated automatically. Zamperini and Phil managed to inflate the second one using a hand pump and CO2 cartridges. The 3 men climbed aboard, taking stock of their situation. It was grim. The rafts had come equipped with survival supplies, a few chocolate bars, some tins of water, flares, fishing hooks and line, a mirror for signaling, and a compass. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the sun began to set on their first day adrift, reality set in. They were floating in an ocean that covered more than 60 million square miles. The chances of being spotted by a search plane were astronomically small. Ships rarely traveled through this part of the Pacific. And even if rescue came, how long could they survive out here? The military's own survival experts believed that 3 weeks was the absolute maximum anyone could survive on a life raft. After that, dehydration and starvation would inevitably claim their victims. 3 weeks seemed impossibly far away, an eternity measured in suffering. That first night was the worst. The temperature dropped, and the men shivered uncontrollably in their wet clothes. Sharks appeared almost immediately, drawn by the scent of blood from their injuries and the unusual commotion in the water. The men could see them in the moonlight, gray shapes gliding beneath the rafts, bumping against the rubber, testing it with their teeth. Mac panicked. He'd been injured in the crash and was in shock, his eyes wild with fear. While Zamperini and Phil tried to sleep, Mac did something unforgivable. He ate all of the chocolate bars, all of them. When they discovered what he'd done in the morning, Zamperini was furious. Those chocolate bars represented days of survival, carefully rationed energy that could have kept them alive while they figured out how to catch fish or collect rainwater. Now they had nothing. Mac broke down in tears, but the damage was done. Their already slim chances of survival had just gotten slimmer. The sun, the sea, and the sharks. The sun rose on their second day adrift, and with it came a heat that felt like being slowly roasted alive. The Pacific sun was merciless, beating down on the tiny rafts with an intensity that turned the rubber hot to the touch. There was no shade, no escape, nowhere to hide. Zamperini and Phil jury-rigged a canopy using one of the emergency tarps, but it provided only minimal relief. The reflected light off the water was blinding, even with their eyes closed. Within hours, their skin began to burn, blistering in angry red patches that would crack and bleed. But the sun was only one of their problems. They had water for maybe a week if they rationed it carefully. Tiny sips from the emergency tins that did almost nothing to quench their desperate thirst. The salt spray from the waves only made it worse, coating their lips and faces with a salty crust that drew moisture from their bodies. And always, there were the sharks. The Pacific was thick with them. White-tipped sharks, blue sharks, hammerheads, and worst of all, oceanic white-tipped sharks, known to sailors as sea dogs for their aggressive, fearless behavior. They circled the rafts constantly, sometimes bumping them so hard the men thought the rubber would tear. The sharks seemed to sense weakness. They focused their attention on Mac, who was in the worst shape, his movements sluggish and his breathing labored. One particularly large shark would surface next to his raft and stare at him with its cold, dead eyes, as if sizing him up for a meal. Zamperini and Phil developed a defense strategy. Whenever a shark got too close or too aggressive, they would punch it in the nose or gouge at its eyes. It sounds insane, fighting sharks with bare hands, but it worked. The sharks were surprised by the resistance and would back off, at least temporarily. One shark was particularly persistent, circling back again and again. Zamperini managed to grab it by the tail during one pass and drag it partially into the raft. He and Phil tried to kill it, hoping to use it for food, but the shark thrashed with such power that they had to let it go before it capsized them. The days blurred together in a haze of sun, thirst, and constant vigilance. They tried to catch fish using the emergency fishing kit, fashioning hooks and line, but the fish proved maddeningly difficult to catch. They'd nibble at the bait and swim away. When they did manage to hook one, the line would break, or a shark would steal it. Rain from heaven. On the 8th day, salvation came from the sky. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, building into towering thunderheads that promised rain. The men were so dehydrated by this point that their tongues were swollen, their lips split and bleeding. They hadn't urinated in days. Their bodies were shutting down. When the rain finally came, it was like a gift from God. They spread out the tarps and canvas to catch every precious drop, funneling it into their mouths and the empty water tins. The rain was warm and fresh, and they drank until their stomachs ached. For the first time since the crash, they had hope. The storms became their salvation. Every few days, rain squalls would sweep across their section of ocean, and the men became expert at collecting water. They learned to read the clouds, to predict when rain was coming. They stored water in every container they had, even using one of the empty flare cartridges as a makeshift canteen. But the storms were also dangerous. The wind would whip the ocean into violent waves that threatened to capsize the rafts or tear them apart. Lightning cracked across the sky and more than once struck close enough that they could feel the electrical charge in the air. They had to constantly bail water from the rafts to keep from sinking. Between the storms, the sun returned with a vengeance. The men's skin was now peeling off in sheets, burned black in places, raw and infected in others. Saltwater sores developed wherever the rubber raft touched their skin. Their hair began falling out. Their muscles withered as their bodies consumed themselves for energy. The albatross and other meals. On day 14, an albatross landed on the raft. The bird was massive, with a wingspan of over 6 feet, and it seemed as surprised to find the men as they were to see it. It perched on the edge of the raft, preening its feathers, completely unaware of the danger it was in. Zamperini moved slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook the bird. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed it by the neck. The albatross fought back with surprising strength, beating its powerful wings and snapping with its sharp beak. But Zamperini held on, and Phil helped subdue it. They wrung its neck and began the grim work of preparing their first real meal in 2 weeks. The meat was tough and fishy, dark and stringy, but to three starving men, it was a feast. They ate every scrap, even cracking open the bones to suck out the marrow. They used the albatross's intestines as bait for fishing, and miraculously, it worked. Small fish began to bite, and they managed to catch enough to sustain themselves. The albatross proved to be a turning point. With the bird's guts as bait, they developed a fishing system. When they caught a fish, they'd use pieces of it to catch more fish. The key was to eat the fish immediately, before the sharks could smell the blood and go into a feeding frenzy. They learned to identify which fish were edible and which were poisonous. They caught pilot fish that swam alongside the sharks, small mackerel, even flying fish that would occasionally land in the rafts during the night. Every fish was a victory, a few more hours of life bought with ingenuity and determination. They also caught birds. Several different species would land on the rafts over the weeks. Boobies, terns, even more albatrosses. The men would sit perfectly still, and when a bird got close enough, they'd strike. It was a dangerous game. Miss, and you'd go hungry, but desperation made them patient, and patience made them successful. The breaking point. As the days stretched into weeks, Mac deteriorated rapidly. He'd never recovered from the crash, and the guilt over eating the chocolate bars seemed to consume him psychologically as much as hunger consumed him physically. He rarely spoke, just stared at the horizon with hollow eyes. On the 33rd day adrift, Mac died. There was no dramatic moment, no final words. He simply slipped away during the night, his body finally giving up the fight. Zamperini and Phil held a brief service, said a prayer, and committed his body to the deep. They watched him sink into the blue depths, another casualty of the war, another name to add to the growing list of the lost. Mac's death was devastating, but in a grim way, it made survival easier for the remaining two men. They had more space in the rafts, more water, more food. The guilt they felt about this practical relief was almost unbearable. Phil, who had been the rock of the group, the calm, steady pilot who kept them organized and focused, began to crack. He developed terrible sores all over his body, some of which were infected. He ran high fevers and became delirious, sometimes not recognizing Zamperini, other times screaming about things only he could see. Zamperini wasn't doing much better. He'd lost more than half his body weight, dropping from a muscular 160 pounds to a skeletal 67 pounds. His ribs showed through his skin like a xylophone. His legs were so thin he could wrap his fingers around his thighs with overlap. He had developed terrible dysentery from eating raw fish and drinking questionable water. But Louis Zamperini had something that couldn't be measured by weight or muscle mass. He had an Olympic athlete's mental fortitude, the ability to push through pain that would make others quit. Every race he'd ever run had taught him that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. He'd spent years training himself to ignore his body's desperate pleas to stop, to slow down, to give up. Now, floating in the Pacific, those same skills kept him alive. The enemy in the sky. On day 27, they heard it, the distant drone of aircraft engines. At first, they thought they were hallucinating, but no, the sound grew louder, more distinct. A plane was coming. They scrambled for the flare gun, their hands shaking with excitement. This was it. Rescue. They were going to live. The plane came into view, and Zamperini's heart soared, then plummeted. It wasn't an American plane. It was a Japanese bomber. They fired the flare anyway, hoping against hope that the Japanese would follow the rules of war and rescue downed airmen. The flare arced into the sky, bright and unmistakable. The Japanese plane banked toward them. Then it opened fire. Machine gun bullets stitched across the water, walking toward the rafts with terrifying precision. The Japanese weren't coming to rescue them. They were trying to kill them. Zamperini and Phil threw themselves into the water, diving deep as bullets snapped through the space where they'd been sitting. The rafts were being shredded by gunfire, the precious rubber tearing, air hissing out. When the plane made another pass, the men dove again, staying underwater until their lungs burned. The plane made 7 strafing runs before finally flying away. When it was over, Zamperini and Phil surfaced to find their rafts destroyed, bullet holes everywhere, most of the supplies ruined. They spent hours patching the holes, using the emergency repair kit, a tiny patch of rubber and glue that seemed impossibly inadequate for the damage done. By some miracle, they managed to save both rafts, but it was close. If they'd lost the rafts, they would have died within hours, either from exhaustion, trying to stay afloat, or from the sharks that would have smelled their panic and weakness in the water. The Japanese plane attack was a turning point psychologically. It meant they weren't just fighting nature anymore. They were in a war zone, and the enemy knew they were out here. Worse, it meant they couldn't count on being rescued by Japanese forces. If anything, the Japanese would try to kill them on sight, the mine's last defense. By day 40, both men were barely conscious most of the time. They drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes not knowing if they were awake or dreaming. The line between reality and hallucination became increasingly blurred. Zamperini saw visions of restaurants back home, elaborate, detailed fantasies of meals he would eat when he was rescued. He could taste the food, smell it, feel the texture in his mouth. These daydreams became so real that he would sometimes wake up, shocked to find himself still on the raft. Other times, the hallucinations were darker. He'd see his family standing on the raft with him, or floating in the water, calling out to him. He'd see ships on the horizon that would disappear when he blinked. Once, he was convinced an island was just beyond the next wave, close enough to swim to. Phil had similar experiences. He'd talk to people who weren't there, have conversations with Mac as if he were still alive. Sometimes, he'd wake up screaming, fighting invisible enemies. But through it all, they clung to their humanity. They made a pact. If one of them died, the other would keep their wedding ring and deliver it to their family. They talked about their lives before the war, their dreams for after. They recited every song they could remember, told jokes, argued about sports and movies, and anything else to keep their minds active. Zamperini, drawing on his childhood Catholic education, recited every prayer he could remember. When he ran out of memorized prayers, he made up his own. He made a deal with God. If God would spare his life, he would dedicate it to serving him. It was a promise he would struggle to keep. Day 47, land. On July 13th, 1943, the 47th day adrift, Zamperini woke to Phil shaking him frantically. Land, Phil croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Louis, land. Zamperini forced his swollen eyes open and looked where Phil was pointing. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, but as he stared, the shape remained solid and real. An island, maybe 2 miles away. They drifted over 2,000 miles from where the Green Hornet had crashed. By any medical or scientific measure, they should have been dead. No one survived this long on a raft. It was impossible, but there they were, impossibly alive, and there was impossibly land. They tried to paddle toward the island, using their hands, but they had no strength left. The current and wind carried them sideways, threatening to push them past the island entirely. For agonizing hours, they drifted, sometimes getting closer, sometimes being pushed away, watching their salvation taunt them from just out of reach. Finally, late in the afternoon, they felt the raft scrape against coral. They'd made it. They'd reached land. But as they struggled to climb out of the raft on legs that barely worked, they saw figures approaching along the beach. Men in uniforms, soldiers, Japanese soldiers. Zamperini and Phil were too weak to run, too depleted to fight. They could barely stand as the Japanese soldiers surrounded them, rifles pointed, barking orders in a language they didn't understand. A horrible realization settled over Louis Zamperini. He had survived 47 days on a raft surrounded by sharks, had outlasted sun and storms and starvation and thirst, had endured what no human being was supposed to be able to endure, and now he was a prisoner of war. His ordeal, as unimaginable as it had been, was just beginning. The aftermath, beyond the raft. Louis Zamperini's survival on the raft became the stuff of legend, one of the most extraordinary survival stories of World War II. But the raft was only the first chapter of his wartime suffering. As a POW, Zamperini was sent to several Japanese prison camps, where he endured nearly 2 years of systematic torture, starvation, and brutal treatment. He was targeted specifically by a sadistic guard nicknamed the Bird, who seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting the former Olympian. The psychological and physical abuse in the camps was in many ways worse than the Raft. When the war ended in August 1945, Zamperini returned home a shadow of his former self, physically broken and psychologically devastated by PTSD, which at the time was still called shell shock and poorly understood. He descended into alcoholism, haunted by nightmares of his captivity, his marriage falling apart. But in 1949, Zamperini's life changed again. He attended a Billy Graham crusade in Los Angeles, and in that tent, he remembered the promise he'd made to God on the Raft. He quit drinking cold turkey, reconciled with his wife, and dedicated his life to forgiveness and helping troubled youth. In one of the most remarkable acts of forgiveness in modern history, Zamperini returned to Japan in 1950 to meet with his former captors. He forgave them face to face, offering them grace despite the unspeakable things they'd done to him. Though the bird refused to meet with him, Zamperini continued to seek reconciliation and peace. He became a motivational speaker, sharing his story of survival and forgiveness with millions. He carried the Olympic torch at the 1998 Winter Olympics in Nagano, Japan, returning as an honored guest to the country that had once held him captive. He skydived for the first time at age 95. Louis Zamperini lived to be 97 years old, passing away in 2014. His story inspired Laura Hillenbrand's best-selling book, Unbroken, and the subsequent film directed by Angelina Jolie, The Science of the Impossible. How did Louis Zamperini survive 47 days on a raft when medical science said it was impossible? Survival experts have studied his case extensively. The previous record for survival on a raft was believed to be about 34 days. Zamperini and Phillips shattered that record, pushing the boundaries of human endurance into uncharted territory. Several factors contributed to their survival. The rainwater was crucial. Without it, they would have died of dehydration within a week. Their ability to collect and store it made everything else possible. The fish and birds provided just enough protein and nutrients to keep their bodies from completely shutting down. They were starving, but not quite at the point where their organs failed entirely. Zamperini's athletic conditioning gave him a baseline of health that most people didn't have. His cardiovascular system, developed through years of elite training, was more efficient at distributing nutrients and oxygen even under extreme stress. Perhaps most importantly, his mental conditioning, the same mental toughness that made him a world-class athlete, allowed him to endure psychological suffering that would have broken most people. He'd trained his entire life to push past the point where his body begged him to stop. But even accounting for all of this, his survival remains extraordinary. Most people who've studied the case believe there was an element of sheer luck involved. Lucky with the rain timing, lucky with catching the albatross, lucky that the sharks never quite managed to destroy the rafts, lucky that infection didn't kill them, and perhaps Zamperini might have added blessed. He believed to the end of his life that God had kept him alive for a purpose. Legacy of the Raft. The two yellow life rafts that carried Louis Zamperini and Russell Phillips across 2,000 miles of open ocean were never recovered. They drifted away after the men were captured, eventually sinking or washing ashore on some unnamed beach. Their incredible journey unmarked and unwitnessed. But the story of those 47 days lives on as testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that survival isn't just about physical strength or technical knowledge. It's about the refusal to surrender, the determination to see one more sunrise, to fight one more day. Louis Zamperini's story is ultimately about more than survival. It's about what comes after, how we process trauma, how we choose forgiveness over hatred, how we find meaning in suffering. The raft was his crucible, the place where everything inessential was burned away, leaving only the core of who he was. And who he was, it turned out, was unbreakable. The Pacific Ocean still stretches vast and empty, indifferent to the humans who dare to cross it. Somewhere in that blue expanse, between the atoms of salt water and dissolved memory, the ghost of that ordeal remains, a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, against all logic, against the verdict of medical science and common sense, the human will to survive can triumph over anything, even 47 days, surrounded by sharks.